You're listening to Desire and Power with your host, Mira Salem.
Hey guys, welcome back to the podcast. This is Desire and Power, and I'm your host, Mira Salem. Today, I want to talk to you guys about culture, specifically the fact that our culture is very broken right now and that this breakage is showing up everywhere. It's showing up in how we relate to each other, it's showing up in how we think, it's showing up in how we learn and how we assign value and how power actually moves through our society. Now, culture is not abstract, as you know this, right? It trains behavior and it shapes attention. Culture is what sets the conditions for what feels normal and what feels impossible. And right now, the culture that we're living in is a culture that just rewards things like speed, service level engagement, and emotional outsourcing. We live in a culture that does not have depth. We are so lacking depth. It's something that in our culture it's inconvenient, right? We see that slowness is punished and ambiguity is treated like a threat. And you can see these effects everywhere. You can see it in the way that conversations collapse the moment that they get uncomfortable, in the way that people rush to certainty because not knowing things feels unbearable to them. Information gets consumed, but it doesn't get digested. And confidence is mistaken for understanding. And over time, that does real damage to relationships, to the truth, and honestly, to our ability to just live together without this constant friction. Now, this is about the fact that I personally think that this culture did not happen by accident. When a culture is built around consumption and performance, people get trained to live on the surface of themselves. And that emptiness isn't just a personal problem, it's a structural problem because empty people chase stimulation, validation, identity, and that makes them very easy to market to influence, to polarize. And then when we have depth that disappears at an individual level, it ends up disappearing everywhere else too. We end up losing the capacity to stay present through tension. We lose the ability to think in systems. We lose tolerance for complexity. And then eventually we lose our grip on reality altogether. So this episode is going to break that down piece by piece. I'm going to look at relationships, information, education, capitalism, and I'm going to talk about these separate domains first because I think that each one shows the pattern clearly in its own way. And then at the very end, I'm going to bring them all together and I'm going to talk about what happens when all of this converges at the cultural level. Now, I'm not interested in soothing anybody here. I'm just interested in clarity because if we do not get honest about what's actually happening, then we're going to keep treating symptoms while the underlying problem just gets worse and worse. So let's start with relationships. So if you want to understand how broken our culture is, you don't actually have to start with politics or media or economics. You can just start with relationships because relationships are where everything gets stress tested. They're where our capacity for depth or lack thereof becomes very, very hard to hide. Something has been massively shifting in how people relate to each other. And intimacy these days feels very conditional. There's this constant state that everybody has one foot out the door, like connection is just something you try on temporarily, and it's not something that you actually build long term, right? The second that things get uncomfortable or confusing or inconvenient, people just bail. And that's not because they suddenly don't want connection, because I think that most people are actually really starving for connection, but they're just deeply uncomfortable with the parts of connection that require things like patience and regulation and staying present when things are not easy or clean, right? Now, conflict in this circumstance used to be information, right? It was just a way of figuring things out. But now it's just treated like a red flag. When discomfort shows up, it suddenly just means that something is wrong or unsafe. And people just think, oh, well, maybe the whole thing just needs to be abandoned, right? We've lost the ability to distinguish between harm and friction, between incompatibility and just your nervous system being activated, or between like real boundaries and avoidance that people just dress up as self-respect. And you see this in dating culture all the time, right? People talk about standards, but what they often mean is actually control. or insulation, or never being challenged by anybody. Basically, people want intimacy without vulnerability, without closeness, without exposure, without connection to the risk of being changed by another human being. And the language over the last couple of years hasn't really helped. We've absorbed enough therapeutic language to justify leaving instead of learning, right? Phrases like, oh, this just doesn't align, or oh, this just triggered me, or oh, I'm protecting my peace. And of course, you know what? Sometimes these things are fully real. I know those things are very real sometimes, but a lot of other times they're just a way of avoiding discomfort and then calling it growth. The problem is that depth requires tolerance. It requires staying when things get messy. It requires the ability to regulate your own emotions instead of expecting the relationship to do that for you. And we're not teaching people how to do that. We're teaching them how to curate and filter and then exit. And the technology of today amplifies this even more, because when you can replace people with an easy swipe, there's very little incentive to actually work through difficulty, right? Because everybody just becomes provisional, everybody becomes comparable. And over time, that slowly erodes the mental strength that's actually needed for sustained connection. Over time, relationships stop being places where you develop capacity and they start being places where you just seek comfort. And the moment that relationships stop delivering you that comfort, they're labeled as wrong. But guess what? That is not intimacy. That's actually consumption. And when that becomes the norm, when people just no longer expect relationships to stretch them and challenge them, it reshapes how they understand other human beings. People become interchangeable. Your empathy for others goes down. Your patience becomes either non-existent or very rare. And trust becomes something that people say they want, but they don't actually know how to build. But I want to be really clear about something here. This is not about shaming people. People are doing the best they can inside a culture that does not support emotional development. We don't teach regulation. We don't teach repair. We don't teach how to stay present through discomfort without collapsing or attacking. And then we act all surprised when relationships feel unsatisfying and empty. And this really matters because it's not just about romance, but it's about everything else. Because how we handle closeness with each other is often how we handle disagreement and complexity in the world. And when those capacities are underdeveloped in our most intimate spaces, it doesn't magically get better anywhere else. Okay. But I'm going to leave that connection hanging for now because the same pattern shows up very, very clearly in how we deal with information and education. And that's where I want to go next. All right. So if relationships show us how broken we are emotionally, then information and education show us how broken we are cognitively. And this one's going to be harder for people to look at because it's going to threaten the way that they look at themselves as competent or informed or awake or whatever, right? But at the end of the day, we're living in a culture that consumes information constantly, but understands very, very little of it. People are exposed to more content than any point in human history right now. And at the same time, there's this massive collapse in comprehension, in context, and in critical thinking. Knowing things and being an expert in a field has now been basically replaced by just having hot takes on the internet. Education is being slowly devalued. And that's not necessarily because learning isn't important, but because learning is a slow process. It requires a lot of effort. It requires humility. It requires sitting with confusion and saying, like, I don't know this. And unfortunately, that doesn't work well in a culture that's built around speed and confidence and instant gratification. So instead of depth, we just reward certainty. And instead of understanding, we reward how somebody is delivering a message, right? Like the person who sounds the most confident ends up winning, even if they don't know what they're talking about. The person who speaks fastest and feels like they know more is the person that people listen to, even if they've never actually studied the thing that they're talking about. You see this everywhere. People just don't even read full articles anymore. They read headlines. They don't actually engage in arguments. They just react to like little clips and memes that they see on X. They don't check sources. They don't look for evidence. They just look at whether something vibes with them or feels right with them, right? And if it aligns with their existing beliefs, that's usually enough for most people these days. Somewhere along the way, expertise got reframed as arrogance, right? Like people used to be rewarded studying something for years, and now it's all of a sudden become suspicious. Being careful with language somehow became elitist. It's crazy. Like saying, I don't know enough about this yet has now become a signal of weakness instead of intellectual honesty. We have a culture where everybody is encouraged to have an opinion on everything, but almost no one is encouraged to develop the skills required to evaluate whether that opinion is actually grounded in reality. And this isn't just about degrees or formal education or any of that. I'm not saying that. I'm talking about an epistemic responsibility here, about knowing how to tell the difference between evidence and speculation, or between correlation and causation, or between somebody who's informing you and somebody who's just performing certainty and performing confidence. But again, the culture doesn't reward that. It rewards reaction and outrage and oversimplification. At the end of the day, algorithms do not care if something is accurate or not. They only care that you are engaged on the platform. And the easiest way to do that is to make people angry, scared, or validated. And I just want to point out that if you really think about it, somebody who does a lot of educational content, it takes them a lot longer to be able to provide that content because they have to learn it, they have to strategize it, they have to make sure that it sounds coherent to the people that are going to be watching and listening. So let's say that you're an educational content creator, that may mean that you are only posting twice a week. But if you are somebody that just does hot takes and you just open up your camera and you do a quick little rant about something that you're feeling, even though there's no evidence behind it, that gets rewarded because the platform knows, oh, okay, well, this person, because they're not putting that much effort into it, they're posting 20 videos a week and people are staying on the platform for longer. So we're going to reward this person that isn't even accurate or factual, but that just brings more people to our platform, therefore making our platform more money. So again, part of our culture that rewards speed and does not reward people actually taking the time to truly have backup for what they're talking about. And so this leads to people outsourcing their thinking to influencers, to podcasters, to political figures, to anybody that sounds like they know what they're doing. And once that happens, information stops being something that you work with and it starts being something that you identify with. And that is really, really freaking dangerous, right? When beliefs become part of your identity, whew, being wrong starts to feel like a personal attack, and changing your mind feels like humiliation. And again, that is just such a dangerous place to be because reality doesn't care about your identity, right? Like facts don't negotiate. And when a culture loses the ability to update its understanding, it starts drifting away from reality altogether. And what really, really worries me the most here is not just the fact that misinformation exists, right? Lies have always existed in our world. But what really worries me is how little resistance there seems to be to it now. How quickly people just accept things without checking. How offended people get when they're asked to slow down and actually examine a claim. And to me, like, that's not confidence, right? That is fragility at its freaking peak. When a culture becomes that intellectually fragile, they become also incredibly easy to manipulate. Because anybody who comes along and just promises certainty and clarity and simple answers starts to sound like a savior, even when they're full of shit. And yes, I do hope that you are thinking about Trump and all the other mega influencers when I say that. Because again, this isn't about individual failure, it's about people that are navigating an information environment that is actively hostile to depth. We don't teach media literacy. We don't teach how to think. We only teach what to think. And because of that, people confuse opinion with fact and confidence with competence. Like this pattern doesn't just stay contained, right? It like just like with relationships, it ends up bleeding everywhere else because the way that people process information is the way that they process everything else. Complexity, disagreement, uncertainty, and when the skills to deal with those things go bye-bye, the consequences don't just stay hypothetical. Like, anyway, we're not at the root yet, because the incentives driving all of this don't just come from nowhere. Like I said, they come from an economic system that quietly benefits keeping people distracted, keeping people reactive, keeping people disconnected. And that's what we need to look at next. So let's dive into capitalism. I mean, if you really step back and you look at the way that most people are living, it becomes pretty obvious that this is not just about personal choices or bad habits or anything like that. There's this pressure to stay busy, to keep improving, to keep consuming, to keep up, and it's all coming from the structure of the system itself. That pressure shapes how people organize their lives, even when they don't consciously agree with it. Capitalism doesn't only influence what people buy, it influences how people relate to themselves. It trains people to look outward for validation, to look outward for relief, for meaning, instead of just developing an internal sense of grounding. And when that becomes normalized, depth starts to feel very impractical rather than necessary. And if you really think about it, like just think about the people in your life. People who are internally anchored tend to want less of the external validation stuff, right? They don't chase as much. They don't look for reassurance from the outside world all the time. So those people are much harder to market to. They're harder to destabilize. They're harder to manipulate. The kind of person the kind of person that doesn't fit cleanly into an economy that relies on constant dissatisfaction in order to keep moving is a very dangerous person to the system. So the system doesn't want you to be that way. It wants you to constantly be empty so that you're constantly buying things to fill that void. So instead of encouraging depth, we encourage surface living. It's not like, there's a rule or anything that you can't reflect or have self-connection or have depth or anything, but it definitely makes it very, very difficult to sustain because there's very little room to actually slow down without feeling like you're being left behind, right? Like in our culture, even rest gets framed as something that needs to be optimized or justified. Over time, people start to adapt by constantly staying in motion rather than staying present with their situation. People are basically not even living anymore. They're just coping, right? It's easier not to think too hard about whether your life feels meaningful if you're always busy trying to improve it. Like it's easier to notice dissatisfaction if you're constantly reaching for the next distraction or the next solution or the next upgrade or whatever you need to do to make yourself feel better, right? Eventually, people just stop asking what they actually want and they start orientating themselves towards what the system wants for them. And that's what creates this emptiness that I talk about, this low level sense that something is missing from their lives. And instead of treating that feeling as a signal, the culture teaches people to treat it as a personal flaw and then blames them, right? If you're unhappy, you just need to work harder. You need to buy smarter. You need to fix yourself more efficiently. So people keep trying, but again, this underlying dissatisfaction continues to be there because it's a perpetual loop. That emptiness is very, very useful to the system. People who feel ungrounded all the time are much easier to direct. They're more likely to consume, they're more likely to attach identity to things, They're more likely to look for quick relief instead of long-term happiness and coherence. Like, power doesn't have to announce itself in an environment like that. It can just continue to operate quietly while people's attention is fragmented everywhere else because their only focus is to find things day to day that fill that void. And this is why so much of our modern day life feels so thin and so surface level. It's not because people are necessarily incapable of depth, but it's because our environment doesn't support it. Attention is constantly being pulled outwards, right? Reflection these days feels indulgent, like you're taking time away from working on your business or making money or something like that. It's crazy. Um, and the longer that we continue to live like that, the harder it becomes to tolerate discomfort without immediately reaching for something to numb it. At the end of the day, people adapt to the conditions that they're in. But this type of adaptation has massive consequences because when people spend enough time disconnected from themselves, they also lose their capacity to orient themselves meaningfully in the world. And they become more vulnerable to um, basically anyone or anything that gives them a promise of clarity or certainty or this, fake sense of control. Um, and that vulnerability doesn't stay personal either. Again, it leaks outwards into how people think, how they relate to truth, and how they respond to authority. And like once you start really seeing that, it becomes very, very clear that this is not just about lifestyle or fulfillment, but it is truly about power, which is going to bring us to the next layer here that I want to talk about, which is meaning. I want to talk about what happens when a culture no longer knows how to generate meaning internally. Because again, it's very dangerous. Now, I know that when people hear the word meaning, a lot of them immediately just check out because they think I'm going to talk about like spiritual mumbo jumbo. Um, but at the end of the day, that's not what I want to talk about here. I'm not going to talk about religion or beliefs or, something abstract or impractical or anything. I'm just trying to talk about meaning in a very basic sense, like just a felt connection to yourself, an internal sense of orientation, some form of capacity to understand like who you are and what matters to you and how you want to move through the world, not how society wants you to move through the world. Um, it's sad, but like I feel like that capacity is just non-existent in a lot of people these days. And again, not because I think that they're necessarily shallow or incapable, but because there's very little in our culture that supports that kind of inner development. We did not build spaces for reflection. We didn't teach people how to sit with themselves. We don't encourage people to tolerate uncertainty for long enough to actually build some insight. We just push constant engagement, constant input, constant distraction. And over time, that creates a vacuum. When people don't have an internal sense of meaning, they end up looking for it outside of themselves. They end up attaching to ideologies, to famous people, right? To movements, to identities, to narratives, pretty much anything that gives them a sense of grounding that they were not able to create for themselves. Something that tells them who they are, what to believe, how to interpret the world. That helps them not have to sit in ambiguity. And so that's what I mean when I talk about outsourced authority. Instead of developing inner authority, people just hand it over, right? They defer their judgment. They align themselves with something that feels solid and certain. And the more disconnected somebody is from themselves, the more appealing that certainty becomes. It feels stabilizing to them. It feels relieving to them, right? It feels like they're just being held, even if the whole thing is a facade, even if the whole thing is an illusion, right? This is why people become so freaking rigid once they attach themselves to a belief system. If your sense of meaning is coming from something external, then questioning it starts to feel very dangerous. It doesn't feel like a disagreement, it feels like a threat to your identity. Just think about, trying to have a debate with somebody who's mega, right? Their defenses go up like this. Their curiosity shuts down like this. Complexity is just absolutely intolerable to them because they attach themselves to a belief system and to an identity. And a culture that doesn't support people's inner development ends up producing people who are dependent on that external source for orientation. And that's a predictable outcome, right? When you don't learn how to actually generate that for yourself, then you're going to look for it wherever it's available. And not all sources of meaning are benign. Some of them are very transactional and very manipulative. A lot of them are built around power and dominance and control, but they do all share one thing in common, and that is the promise of certainty, the relief from uncertainty. They offer simple explanations. They give people a sense of belonging without asking them to do any kind of internal work. And this is why disconnection from your own internal meaning matters so much here. Not in like a vague or abstract way, but in a very concrete one. People without an inner compass are easier to direct, easier to mobilize, easier to polarize. And once that becomes widespread, authority no longer needs to be earned through wisdom or competence. It just needs to feel convincing enough. Literally what we're seeing politically with conservative parties in pretty much all westernized nations right now. It's sad that there's very little room for not knowing these days. And there's very little patience for slow understanding, because when our meaning becomes outsourced like this, certainty becomes a substitute for depth. And like this is basically the cumulative result of everything that we just talked about, right? A culture that discourages depth in relationships, that rewards speed over understanding, and that ultimately keeps people distracted all the time, is a culture that cannot lead us into a future where we are actually happy and thriving. If you look at it, you have a population that is absolutely hungry for meaning, but completely and utterly unequipped to generate it internally. And, that hunger doesn't go away, it just gets redirected, which is kind of leading us into the next step of the conversation here. Once you see how these patterns operate individually, then it becomes very, very impossible to ignore what happens when they converge at the collective level. How they shape power and how they shape authority and how they shape the freaking political landscape that we're all now living in. All right, so I rambled a lot there. I'm going to try to tie it all together now. When all of this comes together, this is what I see, and that this is how I see it translated into the real world. We see relationships fall apart a lot faster. We see people not trusting each other. We see the fact that everybody is guarded. We see that dating feels very brutal. Friendships feel very thin, like you can't really rely on them. Nobody really knows how to stay when things get hard. Nobody feels safe enough to be honest with each other. That in turn creates more loneliness. And unfortunately, we're seeing it everywhere, right? People are isolated, they're touch starved, they're emotionally exhausted. And this is all while they're constantly around other people, which is the saddest part. We have mental health numbers that keep climbing, and we all keep acting like it's some sort of a mystery, which is crazy, right? Because I can see very clearly where it's coming from. Anxiety is through the roof, depression is everywhere. People are feeling overwhelmed just existing in today's world. And instead of asking what kind of culture produces these things, we just keep telling individuals to cope harder. Like it's insane that that is not the solution here. And at the same time, we're seeing things like men and women turning on each other, There's so much resentment on both sides. Everybody feels blamed. Everybody feels unseen. And instead of just slowing all of this shit down and asking what is actually broken underneath all of it, we just keep pouring freaking gasoline on it. We just keep creating rage content and gender wars and endless freaking arguments that go nowhere. And that division is not accidental and it's not harmless, okay? Zoom out for me. When you have a population that is that lonely and that dysregulated and that insecure and that depressed, what do you think is going to happen? Democracy gets very, very fragile. Democratic systems depend on people being able to think clearly, on people being able to tolerate disagreement, on people being able to stay grounded in reality. So when people lose those capacities, they stop wanting participation and they start wanting somebody else to take control. They want relief, they want certainty, they want somebody to tell them what to think and who to blame. And that is exactly how authoritarianism creeps in, guys. It is not all at once. It happens slowly. It happens through exhaustion, through fear, and through people giving up responsibility because it just feels like too much. And now, while all of this is happening, capitalism just keeps tightening its grip on us, right? Things are getting more expensive. Housing is becoming absolutely unattainable for most people in younger generations. Work is becoming more unstable. People are working harder and harder just to survive, and then they spend what little energy they have left trying to buy relief from how empty they feel. That's the trap, and we're all in it. And if nothing changes, it's only going to get worse. When people are stuck in survival mode, they don't organize, they don't resist, they don't think long term. They're just so busy trying to get through the week, right? And this is how you end up with a system where most people are poorer, more dependent, more controlled, and you know, we're just being told that like this is what life is now. And I'm not okay with that. And that's why I keep coming back to culture. Not as this abstract idea, but as the thing that determines whether people can actually handle freedom. Because freedom is hard, people. Democracy is hard. Living meaningfully is hard. And we have built a culture that avoids hard things instead of training people to meet them. And this is where I think North American culture really went off track. We treat discomfort like harm. We assume that if something is hard, then something must be wrong. We lower expectations instead of teaching people how to build capacity. And then and then people grow up basically not trusting themselves to handle life because they were never taught that they could. Other cultures don't frame struggle in the same way, right? A lot of Eastern European cultures, a lot of East Asian cultures, difficulty is expected, right? If a kid is bad at something, their response is not to remove the challenge like it is to a lot of North American parenting styles, right? It's actually just to practice. It's to tell that kid, hey, you're not that great at this yet, but keep going, right? The message is simple. You can get better at hard things. That's what builds real confidence. The kind that doesn't just collapse the second that life pushes back on you a little bit. We've moved away from that and now we're paying the price for it. And it's just sad, man. It's just sad because we could be so much better if we didn't let full-blown unchecked capitalism take control of our culture. Now, I want to be honest about the fact that I don't think that there's any sort of quick fixes here. I don't think there's a single reform that ends up saving us. And I think anybody that's promising you a quick solution is full of shit. Changing something this deep takes a very long time. I'm pretty sure it's going to take generations if we're able to change it. And that doesn't mean that we're powerless, right? But we can start looking in the direction that we need to go now, and we can start these conversations now. I think that change really does start with education. Um, It starts with education that values depth instead of speed. It starts with teaching people how to think rather than what to think. It starts with normalizing effort and frustration and discomfort as part of life, part of learning, part of being human, instead of treating them like damage. Um, and on an individual level, it starts with refusing to live life on the surface, even when that is what the culture rewards. So it's again, it's choosing to do hard things. And that might not save everything, but without that initial shift, none of the bigger things even stand a chance here. So, yeah, I think that's where I'm going to land this episode. Uh, Unfortunately, not necessarily with optimism, but definitely with honesty. If we don't change how we live and learn and relate to each other, this does not end well for us. End of story. It's going to lead to societal collapse. And, I know this was heavy, but if this kind of conversation did resonate with you or it helped you put language to things that you've been seeing and feeling, you can find a lot more of my work that is going to be just like this, that I'm going to link in the show notes because I do talk about culture and relationships. I talk about desire and power. I talk about things that are not easy and I try to stay neutral and not necessarily talk about like easy fixes and solutions, but just create conversations, create education, create more awareness. So definitely follow me there if you want to keep engaging with this stuff. And again, thank you if you have listened all the way through. I know this was heavy, but it really matters. So thank you so, so much for being here. I'll see you guys next time.
Thanks for listening. Be sure to hit that follow button to know when the next episode releases.